everyone, Mr. Rogers here. Today we are going to do one of my favorite concepts in math class. Today we are multiplying and dividing fractions. And I know as soon as I said the word fractions, I probably just lost you all. But that's okay because I am going to get you to love multiplying and dividing fractions as much as I do. Okay, so I know when you see fractions in the math world as a math student or as a teacher teaching math, fractions can be scary. I know a lot of people don't like fractions, but I promise you, when you multiply and divide fractions, they are not as scary as, for say, if you had to add or subtract fractions. Because I know and you know when we have to add and subtract fractions, we have to get like denominators. That way we can add or subtract our numerators and drag our denominator over. But when we multiply and divide fractions, we don't have to do that. It is easy peasy lemon squeezy. Okay, so today we are going to be learning how we multiply and divide fractions. Okay, so first off, I'm going to teach you how to multiply fractions. Okay, so if you look up here on my board, I have two rules when we multiply fractions. Rule number one, you multiply the numerators. Rule number two, you multiply the denominators. Just like that. That's how easy multiplying fractions are. You just multiply your two numerators or however many numerators you have, and then you multiply your denominators. So let's go through a couple examples. So if I was to give you the problem, 1/2, and I want you to multiply 5/4. What does that give you? Well, if we look at our first rule, multiply the numerators. So I'm going to look at my two numerators, 1 and 5. I'm going to multiply them. 1 times 5 is 5. Okay, so all I did was I looked at my numerators and I multiplied them. Now I'm going to look at my denominators. 2 and 4. I'm going to multiply those. 2 times 4 is 8. So 1/2 times 5/4 is 5/8. Okay, so all I did was multiply my numerators, then multiplied my denominators. Let's look at another example. If I give you 1/4, I want you to multiply 3/5. Okay, so I look at my numerators, 1 and 3. I multiply those. 1 times 3 is 3. Then I look at my denominators and multiply those. 4 times 5 is 20. So 1/4 times 3/5 is 3/20. Okay, let's look at two more examples. Of how we multiply fractions. So if I was to give you the example, 4/6, and I want you to multiply 1/4. Okay, so what you're going to do, you're going to look at your numerators and then multiply your numerators first. So 4 and 1, I'm going to multiply those. 4 times 1 is 4. Then I look at my denominators and I'm going to multiply those. 6 times 4 is 24. So 4/6 times 1/4 is 4/24. Then one last example, 3/10. I'm going to multiply 5/6. All right, look at my numerators, multiply those. 3 times 5 is 15. Look at my denominators, multiply those. 10 times 6 is 60. So 3/10 times 5/6 is 15/60. Okay, so multiplying fractions is not difficult at all. All that you have to do is when you have your problem set up, you multiply your numerators and then you multiply your denominators. Not bad at all. Okay, now we're going to look at the division side of fractions. Okay, because as good mathematicians, we should already know that multiplication and division are inverse operations. Okay, so these are two of the more common or I wouldn't say more common because all four operations that we do in a math class is common. But these are the two, when you get into a higher grade level, the more that you see multiplication and division. Okay, so these two operations, multiplication and division, are inverse, which just means they undo each other. Okay, so if you had a problem and you had to divide, to be able to undo that, you would just do multiplication. All right, so let's look at how we would divide fractions. If you look up here on my board, I have 3 rules this time. Rule number 1, flip the second fraction. Okay, that will make sense when I get into a couple examples here in a second. Rule number 2 is multiply the numerators. Rule number 3, multiply the denominators. So if you notice, the only difference when we divide fractions is that first rule. Okay, so when we divide fractions, it's just like when we multiply fractions. The only difference is we have a step before we can multiply the numerators and then multiply the denominators. And that's to flip the second fraction. Okay, this is a lot easier if you do this method. Okay, if you actually do it the long way of converting it to a decimal or whatever way you want to do, it's going to be a lot more work. So if you do it this little shortcut way, it's going to save you a lot of time. Okay, so let's hop into a couple examples to make sure we know how to divide fractions. All right, so if I gave you the example, let's do 1/6, and I want you to divide 8/11. All right, so if we look at my first step, or my first rule, is to flip the second fraction. So in my problem right here, my 8/11 is my second fraction. So what that means is when I say flip the second fraction, that means I'm just going to make my numerator my new denominator and my denominator my numerator. So instead of it being 8/11, I'm going to make it 11/8. Okay, so all I did was I took my numerator, I put it in my denominator spot, and then I took my denominator and put it in my numerator spot. So I just flipped the fraction. Okay? So now I'm going to bring my first fraction down. Okay, now I can multiply. All right, so now I can look at my numerators and multiply those together. So 1 times 11 is 11. Then look at my denominators and multiply those. 6 times 8 is 48. So 1/6 divided by 8/11 is 11/48. And all I did was I took my second fraction, I flipped it, and then multiplied. Multiplied my numerators and denominators. Let's look at another example. All right, so if I gave you the example 1/3, and I want you to divide 8/9. All right, so your first step is to look at this second fraction and flip it. So instead of it being 8/9, it's going to be 9/8. Okay, so I put my denominator, or my numerator in my denominator in my numerator spot. So I just flip the numbers. I'm going to bring down my first fraction, so 1/3, and now I'm going to multiply. So I'm going to look at my numerators, multiply those. So 1 times 9 is 9. Then look at my denominators, multiply those. 3 times 8 is 24. So 1/3 divided by 8/9 is 9/24. All right. Let's look at another example before I try to trick you. All right, so if I gave you the example 3/2, I want you to divide 9/4. Okay, so look at my second fraction. I'm going to flip it. So instead of it being 9/4, it's going to be 4/9. Okay, I'm going to bring down my first fraction, 3/2. I'm going to multiply. So look at my numerators. My numerators, multiply those. 3 times 4 is 12. then 2 times 9 is 18. So 3/2 divided by 9/4 is 12/18. Now I'm going to try to trick you with a problem. And I know that you all are smart, so I'm probably not going to trick you, but I'm going to get you to think for a second. If I gave you the problem 1/2 and I want you to divide 1/2. You might be looking at this problem and already know what the answer is, but let's work it out so I know that you all know how to divide fractions. Okay, so I'm going to look at my second fraction. I'm going to flip it, so instead of it being 1/2, it's going to be 2 ones. And if you notice right here, what this means when you have a number over 1, that means it's just equal to that number. So this fraction right here is actually equal to 2, but it's just putting it in a fraction form. So it's taking a whole number and putting it in the fraction form. That's why it's 2 over 1. Okay? So now I'm going to bring my first fraction down, 1/2, and I'm going to multiply. Okay, so my numerators, when I multiply those, 1 times 2 is 2. Then my denominators, multiply those, 2 times 1 is 2. If you look right here, 2 over 2. When a number is over itself, that just means it's equal to 1. So 1/2 divided by 1/2 is 1. I tried to trick you all, but I know I didn't trick you because you all are good mathematicians and you're able to figure that out yourself. All right, so like I told you, multiplying and dividing fractions is not as scary as people make it out to be, okay? I love multiplying and dividing fractions because it's so easy, okay? So remember, when you multiply fractions, all that you have to do is multiply your numerators and then multiply your denominators, and that's your answer, okay? Then when you divide fractions, your first step needs to be you need to flip that second fraction. So that second fraction, your numerator actually becomes your denominator, and your denominator becomes your new numerator, okay? Then when you flip that fraction, then you bring down the first fraction, and then you multiply your numerators, and then multiply your denominators, and you have your answer. I hoped I got you all to enjoy multiplying and dividing fractions more than what you did. Until next time, I hope this video helped. Bye, guys.